My name is Chelsea. This is my PowerPoint for my considerations for ELL, or English Language Learners Evaluation. This first slide is the question for students sometimes speak with dialects or differences in language that are related to their culture. What is your professional opinion on how these differences impact assessment approaches in oral language? So, when a student is speaking with dialects or differences in language that are related to their culture, it can impact the assessment approaches in oral language because the dialects can create a different word or possibly create a different meaning for the word than what is intended. For example, if a person speaks Black English, they might weaken the final consonant sounds in clusters, like past becomes pass or bent becomes ben. They also sometimes will soften the R sounds. So instead of brother, brother, or instead of poor, po. So this can become kind of a misconception that everyone speaks the same dialects in America, because honestly, we have a thought that there's like a standard American English or mainstream American English, but really all around the country there's different dialects, especially with different cultures that come here, but also with just the different regions or areas that you live. They have a lot of the things that can influence. So the factors that influence this could be anything from race to gender, age, and context, among other factors. So that creates a kind of a impact on assessment approaches when we look into oral language, because we need to consider those things carefully. My professional opinion on how these differences impact assessment approaches in oral language is that even though dialect is not a language disorder, it can easily be mistaken for one, because the professional giving the assessment may assume that a student from a diverse group, even though they are from a diverse group, they still live in America, so they might assume that they have a normal dialect, and then they fail to assess the student's language complete or to the right standard that it needs to be assessed. Students whose first language is something other than English need to be assessed for proficiency. So they should be assessed for proficiency in their first language and their and English to determine, like, are they proficient in one language more than the other, or are they proficient in both languages? If so, we need to assess them in both languages. This can impact assessment approaches if it's not carefully considered. The second slide was, what intervention options are available to students who are English learners if they need additional services? So there's actually many intervention options available. They have several services that they offer. Not every school district, I believe, has all of these available to them, but they should have a couple available for English language learners. Some of the available interventions, if they need additional services, are bilingual education, which can include content area instruction, cultural context, and English language learning. There's also services called English for Speakers of Other Languages. There's services called Sheltered English, English Immersion, and also if the student is identified with a disability, they can receive special education services, and they can receive special education services alongside their bilingual education. And so they are able to receive those types of services if they need them for their English learning. And the last question, why are students who are culturally, linguistically diverse sometimes over or under identified for special education services? So sometimes a dialect can be considered a language disorder, even though a dialect is not a language disorder. It can be mistaken for one. So sometimes when professionals that are doing the assessment doesn't recognize the dialect or the receptive and expressive language, they can make errors in that assessment. This can include that they overcompensate for the dialect and they misinterpret the dialect characteristics, and they misinterpret that as a disorder. Also, another way dialects or language differences can impact assessment approaches is that in oral language, a professional could overcompensate for the dialect and mistake it for a language disorder. So they can undercompensate and misinterpret it for a disorder, or they can overcompensate and mistake it for a language disorder. And then also, inadequate comprehension assessments have resulted in English language learners receiving special education services in reading, even if it's not necessary. So that's why it's very important that we decide which assessment that they are given and what in their first language or in English or in both, because if you are giving them an assessment in English and they show that they have a reading disorder, well, is it because of a reading disorder or is it because of a language barrier, and they need to be assessed in their first language to show whether it truly is a reading disorder or not. And then many times diverse students are not appropriately identified with disabilities because people or professionals might assess things incorrectly, and again with that maybe overcompensating, thinking, well, this is just language, they need that ELL, but possibly there is a disorder. So they really need to be careful looking at that and making sure that we're picking the correct assessments that show if a student does need special services, or if it is that they need that language services, and or if it's both. So that's why we need to be very careful picking those assessments and making sure that we are not over or under identifying the students. And that is all. Thank you.